All right, we're back and we're going to keep working through basic SQL with the statewide data for COVID-19 analysis. You'll notice I'm keeping these videos relatively short. I don't want you to have to sit through an hour and a half video, so I figure we'll do 20-minute chunks. And for a lot of these, you can just skip back and forth between them. If you're just joining me now, you might want to go and look at the first two videos in this series because that's going to show you how to get the data, how to install things, and it'll describe a little bit more of the data and what we're going to be doing. So you're welcome to jump to any of the future episodes as well, but I do want you to know that I'm going to try to at least build upon a foundation. So if you're not as familiar with SQL, this is going to be a good way for you to see how these queries, while relatively simple in nature, can become more and more complex and yet still be relatively simple for what they're accomplishing. So in our last video, we were looking at the number of increases, or excuse me, the number of cases, positive and negative, in each state. We did that. That's how we ended. What I want to look at now is let's sum up the positive, negative, and dates by a state. We're going to go use that group by again because we're using these aggregate clauses of sum. So I'm going to copy this. And once again, we're going to read from that file of the daily occurrences of COVID-19 tracking, and we're going to get the increase for each day. So when we sum all of those up, it's going to be all the increases that have occurred in the COVID-19 testing. And we're going to then group it by the state. So we're going to sum up all the positive increases, all the negative increases, and all the deaths for each particular state. And then we're going to group it or show those results or those summaries by each state. So we'll run this. And there we go. So now you can see what the number of positive and negatives are. We can also then change this. So say order by, how about deaths, because that might be the most important one. DESC for descending. There we go. So we have the New York deaths and the New Jersey deaths and so on. The next thing we're going to look at is looking at the relationship between positive and negative tests for a particular state and then eventually for a date. Now I've commented this out, but let's put this in here and we're going to talk through this query because it looks a little more involved, but it's very similar to what we've been doing all along. Now I've reformatted this a little bit. Maybe it's going to help make a bit more sense. Maybe it won't. We'll see. I want to get the increase in the positive and negative cases. Now, if you look here, we're using that cast again because remember that data came to us from the COVID tracking project as text, and in SQLite we can't alter a table. Remember that from the first lecture. Ordinarily in a database like Postgres or SQL Server or Oracle, we would just alter the column and make it an integer or a floating point. We can't do that with SQLite. We would have to create all new rows or all new columns, and I really didn't want to do that because it's easy enough to say right on the fly, take this value of the positive increase for that particular day and recast it as a floating point. Now before we were using integers. Why am I using floats? Because we're going to eventually divide some of the data. So by dividing, if you divide by integers, you're going to get integer division. I want to use floating point numbers. So I'm looking at all the positives and I'm dividing it by something we did earlier. We're taking the positive plus the negative. So that gives me all the cases. So this is going to tell me the percent positive to negative testing, or actually the percent positive to testing. We'll just keep it pos neg. That's fine. So we're doing that from daily. And then we're going to just do it for the state of Maryland. And then we're going to order it by the date. So this is, if you look here again, let's see. Yeah, we should probably put the date in there as well, right? That way we can at least know what we're looking at in terms of dates. Okay, so you can see what our positivity rate is for that particular day. Now, what we might also be interested in is, let's uncomment this. Maybe I don't want to look at it for the entire year. I want to do it where the date is between, let's say, let's do it to the 12th. Okay, August 7th to September 12th. Oh, and the error I ran into, of course, is I've got a where, and I need to now put an and, right? Can't have two wheres in there. So we'll run that. Okay, so now we're going between September 12th and August 7th. So that gives me the positivity rate based on each particular day. So we'll come back in here again and we'll play our little game we've been playing all along in the previous videos. Let's copy that. We'll go into Excel and we'll paste it. There we go. And I'm going to get rid of these two columns because I don't really want them. There we go. And now we can select all of these and go into Insert, and we will create a graph. So this looks at the positivity rate for the state of Maryland. Now notice I got a little bit more than I bargained for, right? Because I got the negative increase and the positive increase. What's really great about SQL is just do this. Get rid of him. And that's it. Now I have my two records. And again, we can do this not only for Maryland, but we can do it for New York. Right? So where are we getting daily positivity rates for any state in the country? Let's do this one, Nevada. Right? Where are you going to get that? Well, right here. The data is at our fingertips. We can then issue an SQL command like this and begin to get that information. Here's another one we'll look at, and I'm going to get rid of one of the columns. I don't really need this posneg field. And again, you could go back to that original website on the COVID-19 tracking project, and it'll tell you what all the field names are. But I'm going to get rid of this posneg. I'm not really interested in it. I don't think it's providing us with any valuable information. But this is another way to look at the relationship between positive increase related to negative increase, right? So there's different states are calculating this in different ways. Some are taking all tests, right, and dividing it into the positive. Some are taking the positive and just dividing it by the negative. So you could choose whatever you want to do. So here you can see just a little bit slightly different result. We can put the date in there easily enough. And there it is for Maryland. And here it is for Florida. Right, so it's that easy to begin to grab that information. You can see the Florida rates are much higher when we calculate it in this fashion. But when we come through and calculate it this way, it's a little bit smaller, right? Because we're taking the sum of all of the values for all of the tests. And again, we can go into Excel, delete that, throw this in here, and let's create our graph. Right, so that's our positive and negative rates. Again, and remember what we did here, this is just between August 7th and September 12th. Right, we can change that, of course, and make this a where, and rerun it. Simple as that. Select all, copy, come back here, and do it again. Oops. There we go. Oops. Oh, I made one mistake. I need to order this by ascending date order so that the top one, ASC, so that the top date is the earliest one. There we go. So I'm going to say select all. We'll copy that, and we'll bring this back into Excel. And now let's get rid of that first column. I don't really need that. And let's select all of these. So now let's look at what that positivity rate is. We could look at a different kind of chart or one like that. Right? So you can see how the positivity rate has changed in Florida over the entire time. Now, honestly, that's a lot of data to absorb. So what I would rather do is let's look at the positivity rate for the week or the month. So it's pretty much the same mathematical formula we used before. We added the positive and the negatives, and we divided that into the total positive. So that gave us a positive rate. But now what I want to do is I want to select that not from daily, but from this other query. In fact, let's just copy this query and we'll talk about it. So this is a subquery, and this is another real nice benefit of SQL is we can do these sorts of things. So when I run this, I missed a parenthesis. Let's run that. There we go. This is giving me all the different months. This is like a table, isn't it? Well, when I put this in parentheses, it's treating it as though I'm reading it from a table. So what is this doing? Well, for the state of New York, it is getting the sum of all the positive increases and all the negative increases. It's grabbing the month and it's grouping it by the month. So in other words, what it's doing is summing up all the positive cases, all the negative cases for each month in New York. But remember, we're not done. That's the table we're selecting out of, right? Instead of daily, which has all the daily records, now we're selecting out of this thing, and I call it T, right? So we put that in parentheses and we say as T. Now, what I've grabbed is the month name. You can see that here, and it's called MNTH. So I'm saying that value I'm going to return as a field called month, or MNTH at least. And then the positive increase, I'm going to call that tote positive. The negative increase, I'm going to call that tote negative. So let's copy this. So what I've done, so this whole table here is what we just talked about. So out of that table, which has these three columns, I'm going to get the tote positive and the tote negative. And I'm also going to add the total positive and the total negative as total tests. And then I'm going to take the total positive, I'm going to cast that as a real because I want to do some division, and I'm going to divide that by the positive and negative, and I'm going to return that as a real value. All right, so we've been doing all this before. We're just kind of stringing it all together. So there we go. So for New York, we now have the positive rate over time. But now rather than looking at it from a daily standpoint, I'm looking at it over each month. So again, we can change New York to Maryland if we want. And that's letting me know what Maryland's positivity rate looks like over the entire pandemic, summarized by each month. Now remember, a lot of our positivity rate, some of that's related to how many cases were taken and how they were doing their sampling. So early on, oftentimes it was people feeling sick went to the hospital, so more of a percentage were probably feeling or probably positive already. So again, we'll come in, we'll select all of these, and I'm going to copy them, and then we'll come back into Excel and get rid of these rows here, or these columns. We don't really need those. And then let's look at our graph. Right, so here we see what the positivity rate in Maryland looked like for each month. Now again, I've kind of muddied the waters by putting all these other columns in. By the way, it's good to put these columns in oftentimes because it's a way for us to just double check our math, right? Because then I have these values here and I can start to do the division myself to make sure I get those correct. But if I do this, now I've got my two rows that I can work with. So again, just select all. I can copy that, come back in here, throw that in, and I've got a little bit of formatting issues, so I'm just going to grab this one here, go to Insert, and there we go. So you can see the positivity rate in the state of Maryland. Now that didn't give us a lot of values, so what we're going to do instead is we can change that to week. Don't put a lowercase w. That would represent a weekday. We're going to look at the week. And I have to change it in two places. And we'll do this for New York right now. So we'll copy that. Put this in here. We'll run that. So now we can see the positivity rate over certain weeks of the year. And of course, that's not MNTH, that's WK. So we'll put that WK. So that's the week of the year. And we don't really need the positive and negatives again. Get rid of those. And we'll run that. And that gives me, for each week of the pandemic, what was the positivity rate that we've seen. So when I copy this into Excel again, here's our week, our look of what the positivity rate looked like in the state of New York. And again, remember, we can change that. We can make it Maryland. And I get the same kind of results, and I'm going to be able to start to look at that as well. So let's copy that. Oops, let's here copy. Come back in here. Let's just create another row. There we go. So here's what Maryland would look like. All right, so you can see the positivity rates in Maryland. So that was looking at one state, but a lot of what we want to do is start to evaluate how does one state compare to another one over time. So this is a much longer SQL statement. It looks a little bit nasty, but it's actually not. This is one of the real beauties of SQL. Let's see if I can make this a little bit bigger so we can all see it. It's the same query that I'm issuing each time. So if we look in the middle here, this looks familiar, doesn't it? This is the same query that we've asked before. Let's copy that, and we'll just run this one. Oops, gotta get rid of that parenthesis. All right, so this tells me for each week, again, the positivity rate. Let's go back. So now if you look through this, this looks a lot like this. These are two different queries that I'm joining together. So this is getting me the value that we looked at for Maryland. This is getting me the one for New York. And what I'm doing is I'm joining them together. So I'm selecting everything. Remember how we used this query where we selected from this value? Well, now what I'm doing is I'm wrapping these inside of parentheses, and I'm selecting everything from both of them. And I'm doing it where the months are equal to one another. So in other words, I'm getting the positivity rate for Maryland. I'm also getting the positivity rate for New York, and I'm joining them together where their months are equal to one another. So what we see here is our total tests and each of the months. So here's month 3, month 3, month 5, month 5. So one of the things I've done, which I don't like, I've got pause rate and pause rate, right? That's for New York. So I'm going to change that actually. So this case, this is pause rate MD, and this will be pause rate, I'm going to find it here, NY. So we can run this. Now I have the positive rate for New York and the positive rate for Maryland. Well, that's a lot of columns we're dealing with. It's nice we got the New York and the Maryland. So what we can do here, instead of selecting the star, we can get rid of all these columns for one, but instead of doing that, instead of saying star, how about we just do t2.mnth and then pause rate MD and pause rate NY. So we run that. And now I have the positive rate for Maryland, the positive rate for New York. I can select all of those. I can copy all of those and then paste that into these two columns. So here's, I'm going to add a, let's call this New York, oh, excuse me, MD, New York. And now I can select all of these, and we can start to see what the positivity rate in Maryland looked like to the positivity rate in New York. And they're side by side. This sort of reflects what we saw in the news, right? That New York got hit earlier and came down. Maryland came a little bit later, a little bit lower, and then had a slight rise later on. And we'll see what winds up happening. Actually, depending upon when you watch this video, it might be December. And let's see what those numbers start to look like. Well, we just grouped everything by month, but a lot of what you've been hearing is, what about 7-day averages? So I've got a query here that's going to find hospitalizations, cases, and deaths on a 7-day average. This, by the way, is wrong, but I'm not going to re-upload the file. We'll just fix that in a moment, and I'll explain it to you. So let's come back into here, and we'll select all of these. So here, what I'm doing again is, and let's just pretty this up a little bit. Okay, so I'm getting the average hospitalization, death, and positive increases for the records that I'm looking at. But again, I'm having to cast that value as a floating point so I can actually get an average. And then I'm going to select it from daily. And again, just to make this a little clearer, we can say as. You don't really need to put as, but when people are reading this, it's probably a little bit better. So I'm pretending daily is two different tables. One's called D1, one's called D2. So I'm kind of spoofing it. Then I'm figuring out where the absolute date, or the Julian date for the first record minus the Julian date of the other table is not equal to 14. Let's do a 1 week average. Let's say 3. So when we're 3 days above, 3 days below, and our values, and it's not equal to, it's less than 3, right? So remember, 7 or 4 minus 7 is -3, but because I'm getting the absolute value, that's going to turn it into a positive 3, right? 7 minus 4 is a positive 3. So this is going to get me 3 days on either side of my date. So we'll do this for Florida, and I'm going to group it by the increase in deaths. And actually, I'm just going to comment that out. We don't need to even do that. So now for each day, I'm looking at the average hospitalizations, the average number of deaths, and the average number of cases for a 7-day period. So again, we can select all. We can copy that, and we paste it into Excel. And when we look at this, you can see the first series, which is actually the hospitalizations, drops off because they didn't start collecting the hospitalizations till later. And you'll notice it's in reverse order. So why don't we do this? We want to order it by the ascending order. There we go. And then I can say select all. I can copy that. Let's put it back into Excel. There we go. And now we'll get our chart. That's better. So Florida was not keeping track of their hospitalizations for a while, but now we have a chart that actually shows us, and it's going to be harder to see. We can zoom in quite a bit. All right, so the deaths are much lower, as you can see, compared to the cases and the hospitalizations in terms of percent. And you can see that here. Here the cases are 6,400 cases, but there was only about 162 deaths. And like we've been saying, we can always change that. We can change that to Maryland as well, right? So it doesn't have to be Florida. It could be any state, and that's the beauty of this. We just make some changes, and then we can, again, select all of them. We'll copy this, come back into Excel. Let's make this a little bit smaller, of course. Delete that. And then we'll just paste the new values in, come to insert, and we have a nice graph. So here's the Maryland data. So again, you can see when they started keeping track of hospitalizations as well. Well, I hope you liked those videos, or this video, and if you did, please leave a comment down below. Tell me what you found out with your state, and if you want to learn more about writing SQL, please visit my website, artlembo.com, and then you can go to books, and you can see different books that I have on statistics, as well as how to use SQL. And one of the ones I have is how to do that in SQLite. This is a free ebook that you can look at, and it will tell you how to write SQL queries in SQL. You can also click on online courses, and you can see some of the courses I have in statistics, as well as spatial SQL, and in this case it's using Postgres and PostGIS, but many of the concepts are similar. And don't forget to subscribe so you can get more content like this as I release new videos.